Okay, I hear a natural silence develop. Can everybody hear me through the speaker? I can't quite tell. Did you hear my voice through the speakers? No? Great. Maybe the battery's gone on this. Okay, maybe it's me. Two. Did I speak out the corner of my mouth? Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. Now it's maybe a bit better. Hopefully it's picking up the mic, otherwise normally I shout anyway when I give a presentation, but this is for the purposes of recording the session, so you should have signed a release form. Is there anybody who did not sign the video release form? Is there anybody objecting to being video recorded? No? Okay, good. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is a double session, and you don't have to attend all of it. It'd be nice if you do, of course. I'm Robin Smith. I have been responsible for the ISA Action ARE3NA, a reusable Inspire reference platform, for just over 18 months now. In fact, it's almost 2 years. And the work that we've been doing there has been, in the context of this ISA program, looking at ways to help implement Inspire with reusable tools, mainly open source software, but others as well. And also looking at ways in which Inspire and parts of Inspire and Inspire thinking can be reused in e-government activities. And what comes with that is essentially our sister project in some senses, the European Union Location Framework. So EULF mainly deal with, let's say, putting location into e-government, making sure that location has a role to play there, where we're much more about maybe more the technologies and semantics side of it. So there's a lot of experience in Inspire of doing that kind of work. And because of that, we have a special role to play in the ISA program because we're very much focused around data. And because of that, the notion of reusability that the ISA program's developing and a lot of the frameworks that they have are being tested by Inspire. The main purpose of what we're trying to do is really help implement Inspire, but this provides material and evidence for other people. So I'll be talking quite a lot about terminology you understand because I'll be talking about Inspire, but occasionally I'll be talking about things from the ISA program. So just to give you a bit more specific introduction around the session, it's in essentially 3 parts, and the first part is roughly the first hour or so. So up to the coffee break, we'll have this first session. As I mentioned before, we really tried to look into doing a lot of activities around missing items in terms of software development, etc., in the first year and a half or so of ARE3NA. And now we'd like to come down to this implementation part and about sharing tools. So the first session is very much about this, and I'll give you a little bit more introduction and context to have a feel. The second session is also related to, I'm glad Giacomo can join us today, this MeSpire session where we raised a couple of questions as well about how to go about putting together procurements in a way that was not necessarily just favourable for SMEs, but allowed SMEs to compete. I think that was partly the point, that a lot of the procurement processes, at least for public administration related work, can be very difficult for SMEs unless there's ways they can come together. So that's their job, that's their story. I'm certainly not trying to, well, I might try and borrow some ideas certainly from MeSpire, but I'm not necessarily going to try and duplicate the work. But the second session really comes into that in a bit more focused introduction from me, but is the opportunity to have a bit more discussion about that. And then to close that session with the idea of running a little game. I'm not going to pretend it's a really fun game. We didn't have time to really design it as a full game. But the idea is that we see the conference as a real opportunity to find out what's going on. So we're going to do some hands-on work on pieces of paper and write things and do a workshop involving work, which might be useful. And then take that idea out into the conference. So if you like and you're interested in what you see, you can use that as a little game in the conference to basically have people talk about the subjects that we talk about in this session, and we benefit by having some feedback from other people at the conference. So that's the overall view. So the first session is really, session 1 is really, that'll take us up to the coffee break, and then session 2 is an opportunity to talk about funding, and also this idea of the game, and essentially that's around the software we could use and how we'd like to share it. That's the notion. So you're going to hear a lot from me over the next hour, but hopefully the maintenance and implementation group have a parallel meeting, and they'll hopefully, some of them, join us after. And my colleagues Andrea and Michael will come and join the session. So as I mentioned, we're part of the ISA program, Interoperability Solutions for European Public Administrations, and the shorthand for that could be cross-border e-government. But a lot of what the ISA program's doing is developing common frameworks, common services, reusable generic tools, and you can see that's partly where ARE3NA fits in, and notions about sharing and reuse strategies, frameworks, etc. So the way that ISA puts it is they are a key enabler for public administrations to join forces, to bring down e-barriers, I guess that's barriers to e-government, and overcome financial constraints. So quite a lot of the funding that we've had in ARE3NA is to help build software tools from missing items, so the things that you need to help inspire work, and I'll come on to some examples soon. But we also then, like I said, now in this last phase for the last year or so of ARE3NA, want to look into how to really help implement, inspire and share tools. So one of the concepts here about joining forces, and part of my presentation is going to try and explain the name ARE3NA. ARE3NA in English, it means, as I was reminded by Gunther this morning, it's not just about gladiators. This is not meant to be about conflict. ARE3NA can mean a place, it can mean a context, a place for discussion, etc. It also was the most suitable acronym that came out the title of the project. So there's some things to sort of bear in mind. These are sort of terms about the project for memory purposes. What is ARE3NA about? Well, it's about interoperability, partly because it's part of the ISA program, and the ISA program focuses on many areas of cross-border e-government, how to have registered citizens' details shared across borders, how to do e-procurement across borders, many of the things related to the Commission services as well. For example, access control technologies. If you've ever used ACAS, ACAS is provided through the ISA program. We'll come on to that in this session a little bit more, and also we'll see other sessions too. It's about openness, so not just open source, because we're also quite interested in open data. So the resources we have were there to pay for the development of open source tools, but we recognize there are other tools involved in Inspire implementation. Some of them may be commercially available proprietary software. Some of them may be in-house tools that aren't licensed, but they could be useful for other people for other purposes. So try to be very broad and try to understand what's being useful and potentially reusable in other contexts, and not just stick to the open source side of things. Like I said, that's where the resources go for our own developments. And then as well, open data, like I said, it's quite an important part of the parallel work that we do. It's an important part, I would say, of the digital agenda for Europe. So one of the flagship projects of Europe 2020. Some main commission policies for growth over the next few years. And we see some real opportunities in trying to see how Inspire fits within that open data context. And we've been doing work on metadata and data from Inspire through this work. And again, I'll tell you more later. Now, reuse or reusable is in the title, at least, of the action. That's the way of describing a project in the ISA program. And it's this sort of concept that's defined quite strongly in terms of the way ISA sees things, but this is really the opportunity, maybe through this workshop, to discuss what that means in practical terms when we want to talk about sharing tools. And because we're a platform, and because we have this ARE3NA, the idea is it's a space for collaboration. So we want to put that as one of the key ideas for ARE3NA up front. So what does that really mean in terms of the activities we're doing? Well, we want to create a collaborative platform to help share tools and best practices, and that's specifically what we'll come on to today. The other work that we've been doing is we've been developing an inventory of the sort of software tools that can be used, and part of the point of doing this work about developing the platform is to share that evidence with everybody. The idea was we needed that to understand what developments were needed, but the evidence itself, I think, is very useful for the community. So it's to present that information back and build on it. The other side is, and we did a small amount of work here just to understand some of the other policy areas that are dealing with spatial data, and a lot of the results of that were presented to EULF, European Union Location Framework colleagues, early on in that project. So they had some maybe ideas about where some of the scope of their activities could focus. So we do less on that, but it was part of our task. But as I mentioned before, we had a survey that was launched last year that tried to identify some of the tools that could be used. And again, that's what we present back in terms of this inventory. And also what's missing in terms of the functioning of Inspire, like the registry, which I'll come on to in a minute. And also what would help Inspire fit in this wider e-government context. And the developments that we've been doing are, again, mainly open source solutions, but also things like documentation and guidelines. So what we see the platform being able to support is also some form of guidance. Technical guidelines, implementing rules, of course, are all there for Inspire, but there's maybe some questions about how we read them. So just to give you a feel, and I'm going through things fairly quickly here, so please stop me if you want to hear more. In terms of the open source inventory, we gathered information from a different number of places. We did a desk study. We looked at lots of recent conference papers. We tried to understand from the government reports we could find, at least, some of the tools that were being used. There's very good documentation in some countries. The Netherlands, for example, we can see a lot of the entire process quite well documented in wikis and reports. Plus, the 60 or so responses we had to our survey really documented a range of tools that could be useful. And here's some of the items that we've codified them by. And what we did towards the end of last year was really look to see which of these projects were still active, because there's lots of examples of tools being developed, but some of them are being left for over a year. And there's questions about whether they're still fit for purpose. So we've done some tidying up and some analysis as well. But we want to sort of take this, like I said, forward and present this, and we'll at least publish a short note about it on the Join Up platform, which is ISA's platform for sharing materials. But this will be partly the input material as well for this work on the platform. So there's a couple of items here. I'm assuming this is animated, I can't remember. But at least what we've been doing in and around Inspire, there's 3 items already on the screen. AAA is the access control work that we've been doing, and there's a presentation about that later this week. We've helped at least fund the development, and it's inside, it's been led by Michael and Alex Kotsev, about the sensor observation systems that are being developed with 52 North as a proposal for another way to download Inspire data. And in-house, we've been developing the registry software, which is essentially an open source tool that supports the online instance of the Inspire registry. So with ISA funding, we've been creating a generic reusable registry for other people to use, and we had a workshop in January as part of the maintenance implementation group to discuss not only the developments of the registry, but also potentially interoperability between registries. So that's another example of how the work that we do in ARE3NA, it doesn't just focus on Inspire implementation. We consolidated work around the metadata guidelines in Inspire, partly because it was a good thing to do, again, for Inspire implementation, but it also becomes a starting point for work Andrea Perego's been doing between, let's say, the reuse of Inspire metadata in open data portals. So there's something called the DCAT application profile, and based on this work, Andrea's been able to make some mappings between Inspire metadata and open data portal type metadata, looking at potential reuse there. As I mentioned a couple of times, we're quite interested in open data and linked open data, and so we've had a number of experts help us look into how to represent Inspire using RDF vocabularies, particularly the data modeling approach, and as well some issues around the governance of persistent identifiers. And again, later this week, there's a presentation about that work. And then there's a couple of other little things that we've been doing as well, just to look at reuse. So we asked British Geological Surveys to conduct a survey in Eurogeo surveys, finding out what kind of apps were being developed. And the notion here is to try and understand a lot more about users, who are the users of Inspire data? What role does Inspire have in, or Inspire-like things have in helping to serve data for a number of purposes, but also to explore these new technologies. And partly related to that, and also the ISA program, we've been looking at the notions about reuse, and specifically the European interoperability reference architecture is a way that ISA sees, it's a way to describe all the systems that are needed to aid interoperability. And what we've done is map some of Inspire's components, basically speaking the metadata, the services approach, the service-oriented architecture approach to that European model, and then came with the idea about what components would I then need from that entire architecture, but also specifically Inspire ones, for the use in a volunteer geographic information platform. So we had an expert on VGI say, okay, data generated by citizens, how could we best support that with our knowledge from Inspire? So again, it's a small piece of work, but it was the idea for us to better understand a lot more about the ISA program's activities, because otherwise they would be doing things separate to us. And one of the other studies that's quite interesting, I should have mentioned, sorry, the cross-sector apps will also be presented this week by colleagues from British Geological Survey. And the last one is called PICRIT, and PICRIT was already an Interreg project. And the project was looking at the protection of, let's say, important infrastructures in relation to catastrophic events. And they used the Inspire data models as the base for their cross-border modeling between a département in France and a couple of provinces in Italy. So this was a kind of way not to necessarily implement Inspire, but borrow ideas from the Inspire data models and look at places where they would need to be extended for another purpose. And again, it was a small study, and the results of these will be available shortly. And on that note, a lot of the material here has recently been finished or will finish very soon. So these were seen as some of the key items that we could be working on. And you can see a lot of it's on the periphery of the activities of Inspire. They've been very informative. They've been very helpful, and certainly work around access control in the registry really is an important step towards implementation that I think a number of people have been waiting for several years. But it's not all that we've been doing, and we feel, again, it's now an opportunity to start to consolidate on this kind of activity and do something much more around Inspire. And just the last one, yes, sorry, we haven't started fully yet, but this year we have some resources around validation conformance tests, and we're following the work in the MIG to find out if there's a specific contribution we can make here, as well as another action in the ISA program is very interested in interoperability testing. So we'll be hopefully working with them to take that forward. So what do we want to do in 2014, and the purpose really of this part of the workshop? Well, the registry we think is probably our most useful tool at the moment anyway. So we'll certainly be continuing work on it, and we'll also, I think the 0.4 release is due this month. So essentially there's been a lot of work that's been done since the meeting in January, and it adds new export-import functionalities amongst other things, plus adding more registers to the overall registry. As I mentioned, we'll work on validation and conformance testing, and there will be 2 or 3 other small items that have been proposed to us that we'll look into, sort of small value contracts and studies that will help fill in some more pieces. But what we really felt, and I should mention, of course, that we've already had quite a lot of discussion with the member states about this work. Specifically, we have a working group in ISA called Spatial Information and Services, and we presented essentially this idea essentially over the last 2 or 3 months to have some idea of the value of what I'm about to tell you about. And some people are very keen, some people are very supportive of this idea in particular. So I don't necessarily see this as another round of consultation, because I think we've actually come quite far already. But I do think it's important to have other people's views about how easy it could be to use a reference platform and where the real benefits would be for this community, at least the people in the room. So the notion again is to look at implementing Inspire through reusable tools and to find out what's out there and to find out what's particularly useful. And some notion of what the reference platform may be. So here we are with at least some notion of the goals that we'd like to see for this activity. We want to gather and share details about the needs and what there are in terms of existing and new tools. We want to go beyond the simple lists and inventories that we've been creating over the last few months, and to start to have demos and tutorials explaining how to use these tools. An impetus here was certainly something that Michael was discussing with me, that the technical guidelines in Inspire are very much geared towards technical people. They're there for that purpose. They're a shorthand for the people who understand, but there's nothing actually that says specifically how you could do something. No obligation, but an example of how you could do it. And we think this would be particularly helpful. So we would like to see how we could help countries benefit from each other's investments. Now, this is something I'd like to talk about. It's an assumption here that you'd be interested in doing that. There have been previous work in, I suppose, that's taken into the MIG now, but in the IOC task force of Inspire had been talking about some of these things. But I think I'm wondering how an ARE3NA can potentially work for the purposes of people finding natural partnerships around tools. If several people say they're using the same tool and they want to see a develop in it, can we help foster that activity? Is that appropriate? So again, I'd like to talk about some of these things later. But also partnerships both from finding organizations who maybe want to work around the same tool, but also the people who work on the tools. Some of these things maybe happen naturally, but one of the comments we had from them, at least I think it was our German representative, is it's strange in Inspire that we don't know the tools that people are using. So at least in the first instance, we think that's something we can help with. And the notion here as well is, and we'll come on to the second half of the workshop, is to talk about how we could potentially fund that, because normal mechanisms may not work very well. Now, that's a lot about the implementation side, and we don't forget about the fact that, for example, many countries are particularly advanced in their implementation. Some may be finished, and also how do we support this wider ISA-related activity about making parts of Inspire reusable for others, or to make tools that allow people to pick up elements of Inspire and help integrate to some extent with the government activities, where the work in the European Union location framework is probably looking into examples of that in more detail. Plus, as I mentioned here, again, this notion of open data, so a broader context. And I think what's also very important for the work that's been done already in the ISA action itself is to ask, is this worth doing more? So we take the opportunity a good time before the end of the project to say, how can we make this more sustainable? What is worth sustaining for the community? And some notion of that, we start today with that discussion. So in terms of having a reference platform, and of course, in the near future we can discuss the name, but the notion is this, that there are three parts to this particular activity. The expo, the demo, and the live tutorial, and of course I'll go through each one of these in turn. So what's the expo? Well, like any exhibition, what I'd like to try and do here is have a virtual social arena where organizations, companies, research centers, etc., are able to display the components and tools they've been using for implementation tasks and potentially for reuse. So to be able to have a kind of shop window showing what's available, and also be able to, in some senses, show where are the building blocks, what tools you could use for certain purposes, and as I mentioned before, identify voluntarily where people are using certain tools so you understand a community around the tools, and to continue the conversation we started about what the gaps may be in between tools but also within tools themselves. And that really, in some senses, goes into, I guess, some discussion from the survey, continuing from the survey, and to really understand how we could tackle some of this. And again, the second part of the workshop is some notion of having some discussion about that before we do it for real, as it were, in this activity. And the other approach around the expo is maybe to look at how there could be collaborative development. Now, I think I've heard it so many times over the last 2 years, there are so many platforms. And the notion here is not to build another platform. It's to reuse existing platforms and the investments that have already been made there. And just to mention two of them in the first instance, the Inspire Forum should be a very useful resource. And potentially it wasn't used very much in the development of the implementing rules, at least that phase. But now when we talk about implementation, it's got a lot of tools that are very useful for that purpose. On top of that, there's JoinUp, which is ISA's platform for what they call interoperability assets. So those are not just open source software, but also tools such as the semantics and or the models, for example, from Inspire. The Annex 1 themes, for example, have been registered in JoinUp as an example of a semantic asset that can be reused in other cases. So JoinUp should be very good at managing the tools, whereas maybe, for example, some of this discussion is better placed in the Inspire Forum. Plus, there's a lot of material out there that could be put in specific places, such as YouTube, and then connected to. So the notion here, again, is that stakeholders are managing their own content, but having discussions to identify existing and new content. So it's not everything is coming from us. We're just trying to create a space where that can happen. I think that's our job. But we also take another opportunity here, and that's following a presentation I saw from Ulla last year, where she introduced Inspire as a beautiful market stall with no customers, because there is so much good activity going on in Inspire, but the demand for the data is not very clear. So I would like to explore that by talking about apps and applications. So being able to demonstrate how, by having a cross-border comparable data, you're able to actually do things. And that's really based on information that's out there already. It's just being able to make the community aware of it. So the idea here would be gathering information and showing in a general way to the community how Inspire is powering diverse applications, looking into end-user approaches and show how the content can be reused, looking at developing further some case studies. We've been putting little fact sheets to explain about how some tools are used in public administrations and developed by public administrations, and also benefit from the EULF pilots, European Union Location Framework, and the work on the mobile apps, as I mentioned, in the geology sector, to really show how some of those can be showcased. So it's not like the App Store, but it's at least a place where you can find app and then go somewhere else to download and use it. And potentially, I have to underline potentially, run a competition so that we can identify the best Inspire apps, because we think this might be a nice way to encourage people to pick up Inspire services and use them. So the expo is a lot more about a discussion and focusing around what people are using. The demo is trying to explain what the task is in implementation, and there's no conceit there. It's just that from what we see, not all countries are able to implement Inspire at the same speed. And we worry, I think, to some extent, that some countries are maybe seeing the task to such a huge extent that maybe a step-by-step approach explained in the way we see it, at least, in a conversation with you, of course, would help them understand and break the task into smaller pieces. And to illustrate that, at least, we thought some short videos might be quite helpful. So what we have in mind here is, as I mentioned before, technical guidelines maybe are more technical and maybe aren't so useful for, let's say, pure implementers. The films themselves would try and cover the implementation task in different stages, at least from start to end, and also show how Inspire data could be and services could be reused for some other added value activities in other sectors. And again, the work that the ULF is doing on topics like marine and transport, these could be quite good examples to show how Inspire can be useful in other areas, and a small film about that could be helpful. So it's a bit like advertising, of course, but to really explain what the task is, to show how manageable it is. And I think probably the most useful one is to illustrate how different tools work together so that people understand how they can create, share, and consume Inspire metadata, data, and services. Now, that's for Inspire implementers. Again, I think most of you in that role know your task, but it's also for other communities to understand how Inspire worked and how to do things. So it's an introduction, yeah, a demo. But the advantage of trying to do at least the last one is the people who will be undertaking this work will be able to make some recommendations about some of the interoperability challenges in putting together tools, and those can be fed back to us and also back to the expo. So the expo is where the discussions are happening. So we hope to see some feedback in this hopefully virtuous circle of discussion and development through these tasks. Now, this is, I think, probably the more minor task in the three areas I'm mentioning, because it's more illustrative and it's probably going to be built around a lot of the existing examples. But again, when new material comes through, new examples, or somebody wants to propose something, this could also fit in here. And then this is the opportunity we see of being able to go into more detail. And the notion here is to develop some simple tool around an interactive workflow. So like a checklist, different stages that you have to go through in being able to implement Inspire. So I take a lot of interest from some of the other projects that have been active recently, like ENV+, like SMEspire, because there's certain terminology that we use in Inspire implementation, but I don't think we've come down to actually a specific agreed vocabulary for that. So maybe in some ways what we can do is look at how we describe various implementation stages and be consistent, because in the first place that would really help, I think, people identify not just things around ARE3NA, but anywhere in Inspire implementation, and also describing the types of tools. And I have an example for that in the second session about how we could start. I wasn't out very late last night, but I'm losing my voice. So what's the notion then to build on here is to essentially have a framework where we have the different tools named properly, but then showing how they fit together, and to have this relating to different tasks. And a large part of that would be supported by the expo, because people with software would be able to say, here's my software and it relates to these tasks. Therefore, any tool that's going to set out the task is going to show, hopefully in the end, all the different tools that could be used for a certain task. I will come on to some more topics about that later in the second session. The other notion here is that there's more reference items in the sense of the tools that could be used in certain technical guidelines, or to support certain technical guidelines, or even potentially certain legal requirements in the implementing rules. So to be able to label things and know the role they play in the whole context of Inspire. And as I mentioned before, the work that Andrea and our experts supporting us on open data work, these studies are coming to an end, but we want to be able to continue some of that work and again offer something that builds on Inspire into this wider e-government context, and that would be some specific development work that would take place here, and to show how to do that and explain it in more detail, because obviously there's plenty of documentation in Inspire about how would you like to do it as a common methodology, as we've been looking at for the RDF work, for example, and to be able to show that in practice. So it's not like reference implementations as you maybe see in groups like OGC, but the idea is to at least go into some detail and explain how to do things. And as a sort of effect of that, we'd be able to contribute more of these interoperability assets for referencing in the ISA program, following the models or the frameworks they proposed, like the European Interoperability Reference Architecture and the European Federation of Interoperability Registries. What do they mean? Essentially, they talk about different levels of interoperability, focusing on what helps legally, what helps in terms of semantics, what helps in terms of organizational activities, and what helps in terms of technology, software, and services. So this is the last part of the introduction about the platform. We would like to provide extra guidance on how to use various tools, Maybe we can think about what are some typical organizational settings and explain installation and configuration details if they're missing, of course. And what might be very useful in some cases if some of this is multilingual. And potentially we would ask, to what extent do we think a crowd or the community out there would be able to readily translate things for their own purposes? There's some discussion to be had there. One of the opportunities here, as we see it, is we really think this should be in demonstrated things using real data. So we'd hopefully select some cases, would create this entire implementation workflow using it and various tools, not just one set of tools, but try to make something comparable. And then go further and make this data available as RDF. And also with this kind of activity, illustrating some steps towards how Inspire data could be conformant, interoperable with various tools as a discussion point for the expo. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is a relatively new activity in the maintenance and implementation group of Inspire. So we'll see how close we get to this last one. But I think what many people have been asking for a number of years is for software to be able to have the pineapple badge on it. I think there are a number of issues about what that really means. Can you really have software that's got this badge? But at least we can have the discussion through this activity to show how we are getting towards this notion of conformity. So it's not to be a closed activity. We'd like to be able to see this as an ongoing one. We hope this is a way to sustain some of the work that we've been doing and also include new topics as they come along. So it's a baseline, it's a starting point for what we'd like to see. Now, across all these activities, it's very clear it's not just a job for the JRC. And in fact, what we're trying to do is just create the space for that activity to happen and make sure there's some facilitation of that too, of course. But there's a big need here for stakeholder engagement, and that's why we'd like to have a workshop at the Inspire conference, but also of promotion of the activity. And what I think is particularly important there is to ask the contractors who are going to do this work to propose some different business models of how this activity could continue, in particular. And also, just to let you know, as I mentioned, the Spatial Information and Services Working Group is part of the governance in the initial phase that we see for this platform. Over the last few months, we've had some discussion, and a number of people have said, yes, this would be something very useful. But we now need to start forming and promoting it, and we also need to get some advice from them about initial developments, but also others. I would ask them or them to nominate at least some people to contribute to its review and testing as we're setting up the platform. So that was a fairly quick introduction because I want to take the opportunity to have a discussion with you about some of these ideas that still lie at quite a high level. All this needs to be specified in a procurement that I'm drafting at the moment. But I just wanted to take the opportunity at the Inspire conference to present the idea. The timeline for implementation would be roughly a year. So we see this as an activity that should be building on, again, a lot of information that's already out there. It's partly a case of organizing it and having discussions with people. So there are a couple of points here. I think it's just this one slide. No, there's two. Okay. To talk about the platform features on the one side with you, and then to move on about some potential barriers, because these may be very nice ideas that we're discussing, but already potentially you may see some issues about being able to take this forward. So I'll try and take an explanation of each of these points in turns and invite people from the audience to make comments on this as they maybe see it. So the first one, and I've tried to split it into these three elements. We see the expo as this shop window for tools and apps to basically explain here's the material available for Inspire. But we might want to ask a question initially, well, what do you think would be very particularly useful information to have? And are there any potential pitfalls? So I can see one potential area already around the different types of software and the capacity of people to promote their software may vary. But I'm curious to know in the first instance if people have any notions about that. Or have I stunned you into silence? Claire first, because I saw her first, and then Paul. Yes. No. That's what I've... Yes, absolutely. Thanks for that. So let me be clear. Although JoinUp only allows open source tools to be shared through the systems of the JoinUp platform, we really recognize from the outset there's a whole range of different tools being used. So as I mentioned, maybe there's even in-house software with no license that could be interesting for other people to reuse. And there's certainly proprietary software. I can think of 3 or 4 companies off the top of my head that are very important for different tasks and Inspire implementation. So I want those definitely to be involved, because it's really important to be able to make sense to the local situation of people implementing. Yeah. Paul?
Well,
it depends if you run into them.
but I think it would be useful to have a central point where you can find any information of tools that are available. Also to at the tools that you have made or developed and put them on a larger platform. So I would say yes, but why not? Somebody takes care of it.
Mm-hmm. Just to give you a feel what we've done already for our tools, the registry software is already on JoinUp and every release has been published there. The funny thing about the work that we did on JoinUp, we spoke to 2 people about our idea for using JoinUp, and we weren't 100% convinced about the platform itself. It asks for a lot of metadata about tools that we don't think is necessary. But several people have just decided to start putting their tools there anyway and say that they're part of ARE3NA, which is really nice in the first place, but we've never had a conversation with them. So already something started organically, but we'd like to do this in a bit more formal way and to have a lot of the conversation about the usefulness of tools from the community, because I don't think it's our job to judge there. Yeah. Eva?
And with this experience, I must turn attention to that the tools are important, but what's crucial is the legal analysis at the very beginning when you are working with your data. And there must be a person or a team of persons who really check the national legislation, who check the international requirements, and they decide what are the data which should go on in the way that it's on the national level, which part should be modified, which part has to be produced for the Inspire requirements as an additional new service, and this must be managed within the organization, that they have capacities, that they have organizational framework, that they are able to run it in a long term. And then the tools are the tools to help to have it done. But without this, it's impossible to talk about a serious, useful Inspire. So it's the very practical in-house perspective. And then it's also very much demanding as regards the quality of the staff who is able to work with it. From my experience, and I tell it again, these are people having PhD capacities and being practical as well. It means you need to work with a very advanced, capable staff who is able to have it running. And then you have to, you can have some baseline products where the applications could be built up. So without having a solid database and have it solid services, you cannot do the applications. And sometimes I'm afraid that when we start to turn to applications too early, we will produce disappointment, because nowadays that what the Inspire data can provide are displays which are not sexy, which are not nice. You can see much nicer products. But what's a positive of the Inspire data, they are a chance to have something what's seamless, what's interconnected across Europe. And then when it's practical, when it's combined, integrated, some other people can produce the applications above it. But nowadays we still are on the very base fundamental level to reach the goal to have the seamless data. So it's my long-term experience with the implementation. And sorry for disturbing, but I have the feeling I have to tell it.
No, I think that's very valuable. Thank you, Eva. And I think another part of it that comes out is, although parts of the implementation workflow as we see them maybe touch less on the legal base, because the activity as we see doesn't affect the subsidiarity story, because it's important that we're not, you have a role to implement and we're not trying to interfere there. But what I do appreciate as well, when we had the Inspire Ken transformation workshop, there was a very good point made by Richard from Snowflake that when they do the transformation work, is to bring together the right kind of expertise and have discussions first before we even go near tools. And I think that could be part of the story that we're looking at, but as well, I appreciate that the legal context has to be right to get the political support to be able to do anything.
The issue is that the Inspire deals with public administration data, and it means these are data based on law. And there can be types of agencies, organizations, which deal with data which do not have the fix in any law, but the public administration data, the activities on any authority, and it's equal if it's the national mapping agency or a statistical agency or whatever, they have to produce data as they are given by the law. And so when you are a person or team responsible for spatial data, you need to fulfill your national tasks, and you need to find a way how to provide the international one. So willy-nilly, you need to really think about the legal framework which is existing and how to deal with it. And sometimes you need to have a further requirement for national law to be modified, and there is an amendment which has to be done.
And maybe that's one advantage of what we're trying to do here potentially, is that there will be different experiences. There's always going to be the national lead, of course, but once some people have already completed an implementation task and they have a tool, potentially there's something to learn from others. So again, we're trying to create the context, hopefully, for some of that to happen. Are there any other comments on this? Oh, I've started.
I think we have common needs in Europe, as we have the water directive and the bathing water directive and some more statistic reporting directives. And we have Inspire. Why not finding more collaboration in both developments? So we don't keep on providing data and data and data for every goal we can imagine.
Thanks very much. The other thing to mention, I've been following the maintenance implementation group in Inspire, and they have, I forget which the code is, but they have part of their work program all about the working communities. So if you look at the water community and what the work they're doing around Inspire models, this is the opportunity for that conversation, which maybe not necessarily takes place here. I haven't thought about organizing things thematically, but that could be a particular contribution as well. Danny?
Well, I have more a question on the target public of the whole setup. We were directly involved in some of the activities that you mentioned, and what strikes me in that work is that we have a lot of guidelines and material already. Usually that is made for really a smaller group of experts that can really work with it. And we have thousands of organizations that need to implement pieces of the INSPIRE implementation in all member states. And so 10,000 of people are involved. And we already saw in SMEspire that there's a gap between these top experts that are already working for years on the guidelines and the material, can use these, they know these tools. The others don't know these tools necessarily, but there's a big gap in between. So we need to create a middle tier, to say so, of other experts. So my question is, your platform, your guidelines, your tools, for whom is that meant really? Because I think you might end up with different types of guidelines. For example, in the AAA, the first thing we had to do, I consider myself a kind of expert, but I didn't understand anything about the AAA stuff. So the first thing to do was to try to understand things, and then try to put that in a guideline that is understandable for other experts, for all these thousands of organizations. While in the RDF we were involved as well, and I've seen the draft guidelines, that's not for that level, that's another level. So I think we need to be more clear on the documents we produce, the guidelines, for whom are they meant. And that's not always clear, I think, for the INSPIRE community. And it's very difficult to find the right document that can support your work. So if your platform could already solve that problem, that would be very helpful, I think.
Just to mention your last comment then. There's other work we've just started at the JRC where we're looking at the breaking the guideline documents into pieces and making it easier to navigate through them. And that could be eventually reference information that we could then say, oh, for this implementation task at this fragmented piece level relates to these software tools. But there's a number of things that need to come together to really make that work. But ideally, yes, that's where we would like to go. Eva?
Yeah, this differentiation of the personal or the people dealing with it reminded me that in fact there is also a big difference before having the metadata or the web map services ready and of use. This is something relatively simple, and it can produce progress and show the influence and I think benefits of INSPIRE already nowadays, and you do not need these legal questions which I was mentioning. But as regards the data, and it means also to deal with the web feature services, this requires the in-deep work of both the technical and the data content and legal stuff.
So I don't think these, I think this is very helpful. I don't think these questions are necessarily about scope, it's about detail and fitting it at the right level. The level that we'd like to go to at least is more detail in the technical guidelines about how to, an example of how to do something. So that's where I think we start. I think we have to start with simple things, just to make sure that we bring people along with the process, but also what's the really important things. There could be difficult things we need to deal with that would effort could be needed to make that work and be something of a priority. Jacqueline.
Yep. Robin, I think that in the talking about the platform features, I would like to stress the fact that independently if in the expo, in the demo, in the tutorials or wherever you like, not only to focus on the tools themselves, but about best practices about the use of the tools. Because, for instance, I think that the developers of tools are mainly aiming at presenting from a general perspective the capabilities of the tools. But for the community, particularly engaged in transforming dataset for the Annex 3 data teams, for instance, how to use a tool A or a tool B to adapt the data model to the local case, to how to transform a particular situation different at national level can be extremely useful. So there could be a lot of content that can be reused in an open way according to your priorities.
And I would look at, I mean, there's a number of best practices, of course, from recent projects as well, depending on what can be accessed and reused. I mean, reuse is this word that we keep coming back to. But I very much appreciate that, because I think what we had some notion of is at least taking a small number of examples and doing all the way through, but the possibility to compare some other practices. And again, the notion of an implementation workflow where it's clearly defined the tasks, allowing this association of explaining where is at least a good practice, where there has been a practice that's been recognized by somebody else, and saying, here is something that would support this. I think it's very informative for everybody and not just for development purposes. Astrid, I saw your hand was up. You can, well, it's for the recording.